Hello, and welcome to our latest Nesta Talk To. This is our conversational event series with today's most interesting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions and innovation areas. Today, we're joined by author and journalist Cal Flyn to talk about her recent book, Islands of Abandonment. I'll introduce Cal properly in a moment, but before that, some housekeeping points. The event will last an hour, and Cal and I will be speaking for about 30 minutes. This means there's plenty of time for your questions, so please join the conversation in the comments box and ask any questions you'd like throughout the event. We'll pick these up towards the end of the session. If you need them, closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. So Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good. We have an ambitious 10-year strategy working to promote innovation across 3 mission areas: a fairer start, which focuses on reducing inequality in early years; a healthy life, focusing on obesity and loneliness; and a sustainable future, where I work, focusing on how we decarbonise our homes and support the growth of a low-carbon workforce. So I'm Ollie Zanetti. I'm a mission manager in the Sustainable Future mission team. In my work, I look at ways to increase the adoption of low-carbon heating, specifically electric heat pumps. I look at innovations that can improve their appeal to householders so that more people want to get one. And I also work on ways to develop skills in the sector so there are more trained engineers who can install those heat pumps for householders. So before I introduce Cal, I wanted to say a few words about why I was so keen to invite her. So Cal's book, Islands of Abandonment, is about the ecosystems that emerge in places abandoned by humans. These might be places left empty because they've been used as deposits for industrial waste. They might be places unsafe to go because of high levels of pollution, or they might be places such as buffer zones between contested political boundaries. In all cases, what's really interesting about these places, and in the work that Cal does on them, is that in spite of their damage, they can still become homes to rich, diverse ecosystems. And so you might reasonably ask, what's the link between this and Nesta's work on home heating decarbonisation? And for me, it's this. So decarbonisation has obvious social and environmental goods. It helps us to protect what we have. And that's why world leaders meeting right now at COP27 have got to make some progress. And it's also why the world breathed a sigh of relief for the Amazon rainforest following shifts in leadership in Brazil. But at some point, the conversation on climate change, particularly in the innovation space, can become quite technocratic. We can become focused on numbers like parts per million ceilings for carbon dioxide emissions or the number of heat pumps installed. And we can lose sight of the wider goal that we might have. So maintaining the Earth's habitability for humans is obviously really key, but so too is preserving it as a place rich in biodiversity. But we know that we're already locked into some degree of climate change. So you could say we're at a stage of damage limitation rather than preservation of what already exists or has existed. This can be demotivating for what those calling for climate protections are trying to do. And it can also be leapt upon by people called climate inactivists who argue that the damage has already been done and there's no point in trying to continue working in this space. So Cal's work therefore shows a place for optimism. While it's likely we won't save all of the species-rich ecosystems that exist in the present, nor can we reinstate those that existed in the past, through Cal's work, we can start to see that new versions of them might come about and take their place, and that this is worth fighting for too. Anyway, that's quite enough just from me. I want now to welcome our speaker. So we've got Cal Flyn with us, who joins us on the screen now. She's an award-winning writer from the Highlands of Scotland. She writes long-form journalism and literary non-fiction. Her latest book, Islands of Abandonment, has been a Sunday Times bestseller and was shortlisted for numerous awards, including the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. It was the 2021 winner of the Sunday Times Charlotte Aitken Young Writer of the Year Award, which is one of the UK and Ireland's most influential prizes for young writers. So Cal, thank you so much for joining us and waiting while I did that long backstory.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I wanted then to start by talking a bit about your backstory and the backstory behind the book. What led you to write it and what was the argument that you wanted to make?
Well, I think Primarily, I've been writing about nature and environmental issues for some time, and what I've become increasingly interested in is this sort of overlap between the human and the non-human, and the ethical questions that conservation and environmentalism generally seem to raise. Um, but the initial spark, I think, was writing about the Slate Islands off the west coast of Scotland. So these are former slate quarries. They're very small islands with very, very deep quarries dug into them. Some of them look like a donut, or they're sort of deeply pitted with these water-flooded quarries. And I went there and ended up writing an essay about the aesthetics of the post-industrial, and drew from that, started writing about Edward Bertinsky, the Canadian photographer, and Robert Smithson, and the way that these places can be somehow beautiful in a strange, I don't know, sort of degraded way. And I think, coming initially from that question of aesthetics, I then started doing more reading around, and I realized that there was a sort of analogous chapter of research that was all about the ecology of sites like these, and that sites like these might be incredibly interesting from a scientific perspective, and that both of these strands together, they brought a lot of hope and a lot of, I don't know, depth and complexity to the way that we understand the natural world, and the way that these places, which are not in any way pristine, can have values of all different kinds. And I think it was that, trying to understand the value of a landscape can sort of matter in lots of different categories, and they can become very interesting in themselves. Sorry, that's a very long-winded way of summing it up.
No, that's really interesting, and thanks for that. And I definitely want to come back to some of that sort of question around aesthetics as well later on, because I think the kind of the arguments you make in the book are really interesting around that. To give people a bit of a flavour of what you discuss in the book, it'd be nice to start with one of the kind of early examples in the text. So you open by talking about this landscape from West Lothian, I think, in Scotland, called the Five Sisters, which is these kind of giant mounds of their slag heaps, basically. I wondered if you could talk a bit about sort of your kind of like recollections of these mounds and how they kind of interested you.
Yeah, absolutely. So these were something that was hiding in plain sight, certainly for me in my life. I have family who live near there, and I lived myself in Edinburgh for many years. And so I would often go past these enormous earthworks on the train or in the car. And what they are is they're sort of like bright red, sort of rust-colored hillscapes that are built, as you say, from slag. They're the remains of the oil shale mining industry from the 19th century. So what they would do is they would dig up the oil shale, they would shatter it, they would superheat it to extract a sort of paraffin-like substance, and then they would dump this super hot gravel just in huge piles. And so we have a sort of bulbous one called Green Dykes, that's the biggest, and the Five Sisters, as you say, is very sort of, it's almost like the pyramids. But what we find at these bings is that they're slowly being reclaimed by nature. It's over this quite sort of basic environmental process that we call succession. If you studied biology in school, you probably came across this. But the idea is that, first of all, there are sort of annual plants, things, flowering weeds often are the first thing that come up. Also mosses, lichens, they come in and they start sort of securing this loose substrate. And then over the course of a few years, other species take hold, perhaps things like shrubs, bushes, thorny plants, that kind of thing. And then over time, there's a sort of tendency, depending on what the ground or the soil is, for bare land to turn into forest. And so we find this not only in the bings, but in all sorts of sites like them all around the world. So we have natural sites. So we might look at volcanic islands as a really good example of this, but we also have post-industrial sites as well. So if we've got something that's, you know, a forest that has been flattened and turned into a car park, over time, as it sort of returns to nature, that's a process of succession.
That's really interesting, thanks. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about your discussion of the Five Sisters was that there was kind of two landscapes at play, I guess. There was this kind of natural landscape or this landscape, I'm not going to say natural, but a landscape created through succession in the manner that you described. But there was also efforts to to make it look like a beautiful natural landscape, which ultimately failed. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, and why the kind of like the human created natural didn't seem to work, whilst another version of it did.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this, I think, is a sort of parable for environmental restoration. So it's like a cautionary tale, basically. In the 70s and 80s, there were efforts to prettify some of these bings. Basically, they were seen as sort of hangovers from an industrial past, and I don't know, they were sort of ugly. For a long time, they were actually quite dangerous, like they would spontaneously combust in small areas. So some kids would get injured, they were not well liked. And so the idea was that people would go in with bulldozers, they'd sort of smooth them over and make them look a bit more natural. We'd plant some grasses, some trees on them, and yeah, just try and sort of blend them into the landscape. The problem was that, they are inherently unnatural creations. And so if you want to plant things on them as if they're a garden, you need to fertilize them, you need to take care of them. And so over time, although to begin with it seemed to work, over the subsequent decades, these planted plants tended to die off just through lack of care. Whereas the ones that had never been bothered, although it might have taken longer for them to start looking natural, the plants that were there they'd sort of arrive through these random processes by which sort of seeds are dispersed around the world through seed rain, which is this idea that they sort of rain down from the atmosphere, these very lightweight ones from the wind, or from birds droppings, all sorts of things like this, and tiny spiders, things like this. So all sorts of random processes help slowly build up the biodiversity in sites like this. And the plants that do survive, although it's only a tiny proportion of the ones that arrive there, tend to be well suited for the niche that they find themselves in, unlike the ones that we've planted. And so over a period of decades, actually the ones that were not disturbed are the ones that have the highest biodiversity. They've got some really interesting species there, very weird mix of species. It's a kind of feral ecosystem, not stuff you would normally put together. So it might be sort of subarctic stuff you might see from the Cairngorm Plateau. It might be some exotic stuff that's blown in from people's gardens. There's an endemic variation of birch, which has popped up all by itself. The kind of thing that you can't anticipate. That's what happens through these random processes. And so I think I see them as a cautionary tale, because it's like, actually the process of natural recovery is very complicated and we don't totally understand it. So when we go barging in trying to fix things, sometimes we actually cause further damage. We continue the damage long into the future.
That's super interesting. And just having a look at the comments here, I noticed that actually we have got one listener or viewer who is in Edinburgh, just at the Five Sisters right now. So
no way.
How exciting is that? But yeah, just to kind of remind everyone, really great to have you here. And do please, if you've got questions or comments, do please add them into the comments so we can come back to them later on in the conversation. Just to kind of continue talking then about that ecological principle of succession, I guess it's something that we can see perhaps without really even noticing it in like our daily lives. So if you walk around, you might see it's often like buddleia or something like growing out of a chimney in a building, or that's been poorly maintained or something like that. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your discussion of succession was the way that you highlighted how sometimes human activities that put a brake on succession, so you talk about a tarmacked car park in one case, can actually increase biodiversity. So that sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? So maybe you could talk us through that a little bit more.
Totally, because this really blew my mind when I learned about it, and I still think it's like a growth area for ecology, although there are some sort of official recognition of the biodiversity you find in these brownfield sites. But essentially, disturbance from the point of view of biodiversity is not always a bad thing. So we have some reasonably famous examples, like, for example, in Canvey Wick, there is a former oil terminal which has been dubbed Britain's brownfield rainforest because it's just so incredibly full of life. And as I say, it's often unexpected stuff. Unusual insects, invertebrates tend to do really well in these brownfield places. And often these places that become valuable, there is something called open mosaic habitat. So what that means is that there are lots of little habitats really close together, and that's very helpful for reptiles and especially invertebrate life because they need different conditions in different parts of their life cycle. So for example, there's a place called Ardeer. It's a peninsula in the west coast of Scotland, and it is a former dynamite site. So I've spent quite a bit of time there. And you have natural sand dunes, you have the old car park from the dynamite workers, you have the old buildings, you have some sort of scrappy forest that's popped up here and there. And you also have like large areas where like teenagers go in and like burn stuff because that's what teenagers do. And actually, this sort of mix is like a creative, generative process. And so there they find a lot of invertebrate life, as I said, like lots of bird life will find sanctuary there. And so it's a combination of a lack of disturbance in as much as these places are not controlled in the intense way that we tend to control, say, a park or a street environment. And then like a low level of disturbance. So that might be having once been dug up, or a building having once been built there and now it's falling down, or teenagers are setting fire to things, you know. So that combination of factors seems to be very rich. And so, as I say, it's been recently recognized as actually a priority ecosystem. And so these open mosaic habitats can be, if you sort of survey them and show that you've got valuable species, brownfield sites can now be protected. And there's an amazing charity called Bug Life, which has done some great work in finding sites. So, for example, one of theirs it's a former quarry somewhere in the south of England, and it's got very, very rare spider, which otherwise is only found in like caves in the Mediterranean. But through these crazy random processes, it found a home in these quarries. Nobody disturbed it, and now it's one of its sort of rare holdouts. So, I think the thing I want to underline about these sites is that they probably don't look classically beautiful, and their value is not obvious on first sight. And to me, that sort of raised a lot of like philosophical and artistic questions. But I think that it also pushes us to think in deeper ways about how we can try and sort of save nature, or you know, is saving nature the right way to think about it when it is so dynamic, and it, you know, all of these species have their own agendas.
That's super interesting, and I think you kind of preempted my next question, which is that you have this really nice line in your book about I actually now forget it, having said it's really nice. It's either about sort of training yourself or kind of learning to appreciate different sorts of beauty. It's kind of, I guess, when we think about nature, we think about either kind of pastoral landscapes, though of course they are very heavily the consequence of human activity, or we think about sort of supposedly non-human landscapes like rainforests or savanna or somewhere like that. Whereas in fact, nature doesn't have to be classically beautiful, right? It can be, you know, it can be somewhere where teenagers are burning stuff and that's preventing trees from growing or something like that.
Right. And our response to nature, although it feels instinctive, is often culturally specific. It's often something we've been taught, and it changes over time. So if we look at wetlands, for example, which are now one of the sort of habitats that we're absolutely falling over ourselves to protect, for a long time they were described as wastelands. They were described as, you know, thought to have absolutely no value whatsoever. They were essentially a waste of space. And so people would drain them and turn them into fields. You know, it was just sort of felt like they didn't really have very much life in them. And now that seems crazy, and it's only, you know, a couple of centuries later. So I think for me, it is adding that level of uncertainty is a positive thing. It's a constant push to question ourselves, to be like, okay, so we think that this is a useless scrap of land, but is it? You know, and that level of uncertainty is difficult to deal with, but I think it is a sort of helpful and interesting sort of mental exercise.
Yeah, definitely. And there's some fascinating, just kind of looking in the chat, some fascinating analogies going on in this kind of like discussion around succession and sort of how we expect it to work and how it does work in practice, being sort of analogies there from parenting or to parenting, which I think is actually really interesting. So yeah, do please put questions if you have them in the chat for Cal, and we'll come to them later. I wanted to turn now to kind of more hostile landscapes. So people who know a bit about UK geology might not be that surprised that a mountain of rocks could in time support a new ecosystem. I guess that's predominantly what the UK is, right? It's sort of earth on top of rock. But ecosystems can re-establish themselves, as you show in your book, in landscapes that we might think of as being extremely hostile. And you have a couple of examples of them in your book. Perhaps it's interesting to talk about the nuclear sites. So you talk about Chernobyl, which is probably people are fairly familiar with, and Bikini Atoll coral reef. Could you talk about particularly the coral reef, because that might be less well known, what those landscapes are like, and then explain a bit about how recovery could be possible in such damaged landscapes?
Yeah, absolutely. Chernobyl to me was like the sort of poster child example of what I was proposing to study at the beginning. And the thing I sort of want to underline about many of the sites in my book is not that I think often people think that if you write about things, you're sort of saying that, you know, there should be more of them, or, you know, I'm encouraging this. And I think the way that I came to think about the sites in my book was that they were forbidden experiments, by which I mean, this is a phrase that is often used to describe experiments that are sort of scientifically interesting, but immoral to bring about. And I think that is certainly the case when you talk about somewhere like the exclusion zone at Chernobyl. You know, there was in the aftermath of the 1986 disaster, there was enormous human cost to the creation of the exclusion zone. But we can learn a great deal about how nature has responded and adapted in the aftermath. And what we find within the zone is that species enormous numbers of species have increased in populations, especially those that don't like human interaction. So things like wolves, bears, black storks. These are all species which we don't see a great deal of in continental Europe, because continental Europe is so built up that they don't really have very many species to live. And so they can live quite freely there. And it's something of a trade-off in Chernobyl between the damage that the existing and will continue to exist forever in some areas of it, contamination, versus the lack of disturbance. And so when you have animals like wolves, bears, they move around, they're large animals, and it seems that although the radiation doesn't do them any good, it doesn't harm them enough to stop them breeding, and therefore their numbers have increased, their ranges have increased, there are more packs on the ground. We find that with huge numbers of species within Chernobyl. So some studies show that, for example, swallows are showing albinism. We are finding some decreases in the number of small, like invertebrate life, especially the kind of life that helps with like the breakdown of leaf litter in very contaminated areas. But overall, it does seem to be almost a sort of optimistic outcome, in as much as we can see incredible amounts of natural recovery. And in effect, it's become a sort of cursed nature sanctuary, because it is the fear level for humans was enough for a long period of time to stop people going in. When I visited, this was in the winter of 2017, 2018. So this was before the Russian invasion and the Russian occupation of the site. So things have, of course, changed quite a bit on the ground, but I think now that it is back under control, the large area of the exclusion zone is sort of in roughly a similar sort of circumstance, in as much as is largely sort of former agricultural ground. And the whole area is now 70% forest, which before it was largely sort of pastoral. I think there and yeah, I'll talk about the Bikini Atoll example as well, just briefly. Just to say, in 1954, well, in the 1950s, there were a series of atomic tests that took place there. The biggest one being in 1954, and what that left was a completely blasted landscape, underwater landscape. It was completely sterile. It had been sort of boiled. There was nothing left. It was sort of pulverized coral and sand. And what has happened in the intervening period is that coral has recolonized the atoll. It seems that coral larvae has drifted in from the nearest atolls and generally from the sea at large, and has begun to grow there. And now the Bikini Atoll plays sort of site to one of the most notable coral reefs that we have in the world. It's not as impressive as it was before, because there are a small number of species never did sort of find a toehold, but it's incredibly impressive. It's not really disturbed because there is no existing community on Bikini Atoll, and it's absolutely packed full of life. And so I think that these are I was interested in them because of the inherent sort of moral tension in their existence. The fact that they are so beautiful and yet souvenirs of some of the worst things that have ever happened in the world. So I think that is why I find them to be interesting, and I think that that's why a lot of other people sort of find their attention inevitably sort of drawn to these sites.
That's super interesting. And just on that moral tension, you cite James Lovelock in your book, who goes so far as to suggest, or went so far as to suggest, that there could be value in intentionally damaging landscapes. So I think he suggests leaving nuclear waste in the middle of rainforest to prevent human encroachment.
Yeah. I'd like he's he's a big thinker, and I think that this is a sort of thought experiment, right? It's a provocative thing to be like, if we put up signs and warn people of this, one of the things that they're most frightened about, it might be the best way of guarding things. And there's that trade-off, it's cursed, and therefore people are sort of willing to leave it alone.
I'm assuming you're not an adherent to his stance there.
Well, I think I'm definitely on the cautious side, and messing around with nuclear waste feels to me to be going slightly too far.
Yeah, I think that's probably wise. But it's also interesting to observe that abandonment in the cases of well, certainly initially in the cases of well, particularly of Chernobyl, there was more or less complete abandonment, although it's the case that people have moved back now. But you don't, in some of the landscapes you describe, they're kind of abandoned landscapes. That doesn't mean that they are not at all peopled. And you've got a chapter in your book in which you talk about Detroit, which people will know has deindustrialized massively and lost, I think its population is something like a quarter or a fifth now of what it was at the kind of height of its kind of economic importance. In some senses, this feels slightly out of place in a work which is kind of more about ecology. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about what you were trying to convey through these kind of like abandoned but still peopled landscapes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that whenever you embark on a work of any length, there's a period at the beginning when you have to sort of define your terms. So I spent quite a lot of time figuring out exactly what abandoned meant. Because I started from like a very pure place, these places would have to be exclusion zones, or, perhaps they could be all of different sizes, but the key thing about an abandoned place is that there are no people in it. And then I found that without I don't know what's the word, in every single case, when I got to these locations, there were people there of some description, whereas within Chernobyl there were the small number of people that had repopulated. They decided to move back into their old houses, whether in sort of burnt out former industrial sites. I might find people spray painting the walls and taking drugs. Like there were always a community of a sort. And so I came to understand abandoned to be a sort of an abandonment of its original purpose, and then a sort of lack of control. That there was no oversight here, and so that came to me to be part of its sort of crucial element of its definition. So Detroit, it's hard to argue that it's not full of abandoned sites, in as much as if you drive through some of the neighborhoods there might only be one house in 5 or one house in 10 being occupied. But at the same time, it's in the middle of the city. What does that mean? And it became obvious to me that the question of abandonment was not really a question that you could deal with without dealing with people, because they're defined by the absence of people, or the absence of human use. And so human stories were just completely sewn in, both to the past and to the present, and presumably into the future of all of these sites. And that indeed not to deal with these stories would be not only difficult, but also, I think, irresponsible, because then it starts to be a story of voyeurism. It starts to be a story that is sort of unplugged from the reality of these sites. That question of voyeurism was a big one, I think, because I was really aware, like before I went into this project, I spent a lot of time on sort of online forums, looking at like trip reports, as people talk about them in the urban exploring community. You see a lot of really amazing images of abandoned places. Like you might have seen those ones of like the sewers under London, or the empty underground stations, or there seemed to be like an incredible number of abandoned asylums. I mean, there are far too many pictures of abandoned asylums. There simply couldn't have been that many sanatoriums or asylums in the world. These are often just big buildings that people have rebranded. They strip them from their sort of accurate history, and they become a sort of urban mythology of these places. And so when you dig into the history of those sites, even the really well-known sites, actually it turns out that the sort of received history, or the folk stories around them, don't really match up to the real stories. And I was much more interested in sort of, well, who is actually there, what actually happened to these places. So in Detroit and in Paterson, New Jersey, I looked at essentially what felt to me to be like the polar opposing effects that abandonment has on the human psyche. So one side is the negative side of it. So abandoned places and derelict sites, especially in urban environments, tend to be associated with poor mental health. They tend to be associated particularly with violent crime. They bring a very sort of real risk of things like fire to the surrounding buildings. In Detroit, they have begun to think of abandonment as a kind of like urban disease. They characterize it as the blight. And so I dig into that concept in that chapter, what felt to me a sort of provocative idea of imagining cities to have diseases as people do, and how it might spread, and abandonment might attract further abandonment. In the Paterson chapter, I was looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the sort of thrilling effects, or the attractive effects of abandonment. Like, why do so many people feel themselves drawn to these sites? What is it about them? And to me, I think it's because these sites have some element of what in nature or in art we might describe as the sublime, the effect of a sort of terror crossed with beauty, a sort of awesome feeling of moving through these places. And it's something to do with not only the size and the scale, but the sense of the passage of time made real in front of you. So it brings very clearly to you this sense of like, one day all this will be dust. And also, they're out of control. A lot of the people that hang out in these places are looking for somewhere that they can be themselves without feeling under control of anything else. So as I said, a lot of the people that I banged into in Paterson, New Jersey, were drug addicts, or they had somehow dropped out of society at large. I went there with an urban explorer called Wheeler, who's not a drug addict, but he had always found through his teenage years as a sort of disaffected youth, a sort of freedom in these places that he didn't find anywhere else. And I found that to be quite moving, and I could relate to it, although my life is very different, but I still feel the same exhilarating effects of these sites. And so I guess that's what I was digging into these places. I didn't want to lose the human element. William James described ruin questing as being what was it, a heartless pastime. And I think I definitely didn't want to do that. I didn't want it to be a voyeuristic book, but instead to engage very fully with the stories of people that I found in these places.
Thanks for that. That's really interesting and a really kind of like, I guess, important call to some of the, I guess, like the kind of the sort of moral, ethical aspects of this kind of work. And I will make a confession here, which is that maybe 10, 15 years ago in a previous life as a freelance journalist, I actually did write an article about urban exploration, which entailed a visit to an abandoned asylum. So it's definitely a widespread image. One of the things that you brought up a lot there is this kind of I guess like the sort of intersection between past, present, and future states, which I think is quite an interesting area just as we sort of move to a close, because I see a few questions in the chat which I'd really like to attend to as well. So a lot of what you describe is about ecosystems or nature in inverted commas returning to take over these landscapes which have been abandoned. And so I also wanted to think about this idea of kind of recreating past states and recreating what's, again, in inverted commas, lost. So you've got a fantastic story about some formerly domesticated cows abandoned on a remote Scottish island. I wondered if you could explain this story for those who haven't read the book and talk about what you were trying to convey here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Swona. This is a small island off the north coast of Scotland. It's between, say, John O'Groats and the Orkney Islands. And there I went initially or primarily to look at a small herd of cattle that had been living there since the 1970s, completely unhusbanded. So the last residents of this island, they left in kind of a hurry due to health concerns. They were quite elderly, brother and sister. And what they did as they were leaving the island was they let the cattle out of the byre just to wander loose around the island. They always planned to come back and sort of get the cattle, and some of their family attempted to do so, but very quickly these cattle became quite unmanageable. They survived a little bit sort of against expectations because it's really quite a small island. There are no trees. There's not a huge amount of grazing, and the winters, the conditions are very wild there. And so the expectation was, once it became clear that it was impossible to remove them, that they would probably starve. But they didn't, and now, many years have passed. Around 10 generations of the cattle have passed, and they continue to be I suppose, self-sufficient population of cattle which live there. They get a lot of nutrients from the seaweed which they eat, and there's a spring on the island. So basically their sort of minimum level of survival continues to exist. And they are very interesting from a sort of behavioral perspective, in as much as we don't have very many truly feral herds of cattle in the world. They're, as I say, completely unhusbanded. So the numbers, the gender balance is swings a lot from side to side, and so that's probably over time going to be the biggest risk for them. There was a period in the 90s when there were far more bulls than there were cows, and that caused a great deal of like civil strife. There were like fighting all over the island. A large number of them died. It looked like they might die out. What happens is that they behave a lot more like, say, wild deer or wild horses. The bulls will attack each other and they will fight out for a hierarchy. The cows will sort of run the day-to-day. There's a dominant female cow who is sort of in charge of their movement around the small island. And there are sort of exiled former king cows who spend the rest of their lives on these like tiny headlands. I guess what I was interested in when I went to write about them was this sort of the porosity of the boundary between like the domestic and the wild. Like, what does it mean to be feral? Can a feral animal ever become wild again? You know, how many generations are we talking? Because the breeding that have brought us the domestic cow today took place over, thousands of years, maybe 10,000 years. So the history of our relationship with the cattle, their domesticity is sewn into them, into their genetic material. But at the same time, if we're talking about behavior, if we're talking about their contact with humans, which is very, very, very little, maybe they are wild in a sense. They behave like wild animals, and they seem to have sort of recreated behaviors that wild animals might otherwise live. And so I think to me it was a question of, like how if human history is sewn into the genetic material of these animals, but also more generally into the world around us in a concrete and physical way. What does that tell us about the wild? Is there any boundary between the wild and a human impacted Earth? So yeah, I guess it was a sort of philosophical question that led me there. And actually, my time on Swana then became much more of a psychological challenge for myself. I spent overnight there in an abandoned building, having been told not to camp because these cattle would come and trample me in the night. So I was sleeping in an abandoned building full of what I can only assume were birds moving around above me, but it sounded a lot like ghosts, and going out and about on the island. I went there during June because it's seabird breeding season. It's very well known for sort of puffins and all sorts of the migratory birds will nest on this island. So I thought, oh, how lovely! It'll be great. It will be full of lovely birds. But of course, the birds were not happy to see me. This is an uninhabited island. And so when I went out, I was attacked by Arctic terns, whose colony I sort of accidentally stumbled into. I was sort of roughed up by some bunksies. These are great skuas, these ones that will sort of be sick at you to get you out of their territory. I found the whole experience of being on this island, although I knew myself to be safe, to be very challenging. It became, like, when I was writing it up, it became a sort of gothic horror. And I wasn't sure how people would read it, but it does seem that other people also find the idea of it quite intimidating as well. So yeah, I came to see that we as people are social animals, that the absence of other people made me a much more cowardly and frightened person than I believe myself to be. Like, I do quite a lot of traveling around or working on my own, but being alone on an island with no ability to talk to. My phone had died, and there was absolutely no way of getting in touch with anyone for 24 hours. And that was quite a singular experience, and it was a lot more intense than I believed it to. I found myself quite sort of queasily ill. I had brought a lot of sandwiches and things to eat, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. I felt sort of, yeah, I just fully, it was a quite a psychologically grueling 24 hours.
That's incredibly intense. Just in the time that we've got remaining, I'd like to turn now to some questions from the viewers. So there's quite a few questions, quite in depth. So we'll try and answer as many as we can. There's one that comes from Anand, which follows on quite nicely from what you were just talking about, who asks, I would ask about the similarities and differences between rewilding through abandonment or active rewilding. I wonder if you could talk briefly about that. And then there's a kind of follow on from another question from the audience after that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think about it a lot, and I do think the two issues that I write and Isabella Tree write about are sort of like sister issues, but they're not the same. So rewilding through abandonment, I suppose it's defined by the lack of control that we have over it, and that you can't set goals for abandoned land. You can't say, I'll come back here and this will, be, you can hope that it might benefit invertebrate life, but because of the definition of it being, that you're not intervening, there is a sort of serendipity to the results. And I don't think it's helpful to think in terms of goals or objectives for this kind of land. In terms of, say, Isabella Wilde's, she doesn't like to call it rewilding. She calls it wilding because it's not trying to get back to something in the past. So I would say that her example, because it's much more interventionist, although it's not interventionist in a traditional sense, is more like so they have particular species that they want to encourage, and they bring in, and they release them and then allow them to set up populations. They still farm to an extent, and indeed you could sort of reframe it as sort of farming for biodiversity. Like, that's the objective that they're going for. That's a very valuable objective. I'm not against it. It's different to what I write about, but that's not to say that I don't think that she's doing really interesting work that we can learn a great deal from.
Thanks. And then following on from that, we have a question from Caroline, which she asks, what can we learn from succession? And she cites healthy neglect of former industrial sites. And how should we be applying this learning to increase sustainability?
Yeah, that's I think the key thing about that sort of idea of like benevolent neglect is interesting because what it is to me, at least, is it's a sort of humbling. It's this like sense that we can't always predict what the outcome of our actions are going to be, and so certainly I think that there's a value in non-intervention, at least in some cases. You know, like what I don't really like sort of positioning myself as is like an argument against the conservation movement. That's not really what I'm doing. It's more a sort of warning note, or it's like it's a sort of highlighting of interesting cases that I think we can learn from. And so the interesting thing about abandonment is that often they are essentially, well, you can come to think of them as almost like control studies, right? This is like what would happen if you don't do anything, you know, and we're unaware of them a lot of the time. They're completely undocumented much of the time. They're often considered to be sites of little value. And indeed, certainly I find that before I started writing about these places, my eyes just skimmed over them. You know, there are a large number of sites like these in any urban place that, you know, every so often I'll sort of be like, oh, look, that's actually a huge area of ground and that's fenced off. And I just have never really noticed it before because it's not useful to me on a day-to-day basis. It's not a landmark in that way. And so they are, to many, you know, to a large extent, the great unknown. They're often unmapped. We haven't done surveys of most of them. But so I think that we can learn from them in as much as we can study them more. And I think we should be hesitant to sort of roll our sleeves up and be like, okay, great, so this is good, but what happens if, you know, we plant some more trees in here, or this is a great start, but, you know, so because I think we should be, you know, these are valuable sites in as much as they are growing in value all the time. And the longer we leave them, the more we can learn from them. And so maybe when sites have been abandoned for some time and they're not being developed, that's not a bad time for them to come under some kind of protection, because there doesn't appear to be any kind of financial value in them at that stage, but there's a lot of potential value in the future if you're thinking ecologically. You know, it doesn't take, you know, if you start with a completely raised field with nothing in it, you could have a forest in 30 years. All that requires is just not doing anything. And that's harder than it sounds, you know, because actually stopping someone going in and changing that is a very difficult thing to hold over time. I think what we need to be doing is thinking in very long term ways, and often our impatience to see results can make us look at things like planting or things like that, because we like to see the results in a very short space of time. And actually the most valuable thing that might be over time is to, I don't know, set aside large areas of land, but not to plant them, you know. And then, I don't know, I think that the key thing that I want to underline, you know, I come in, I'm not a member of a political movement. And so I always say, you know, I'm not a policymaker. I think I'm coming in as a literary writer. I'm interested in aesthetics and philosophy, and in this sense of what can we learn? How can we be intrigued by, humbled by, and informed by these interesting and beautiful places?
Thanks for that, Cal. That's a really lovely response. To kind of bring it back, I guess, to something that people might see in their day to day. Like I'd like to turn now to a question from Gemma, who asks about urban public spaces. So she says, thinking about green or brown urban public spaces, so scraps of land, brownfield sites. She says lots of community groups are trying to reclaim these spaces for the benefit of wildlife and the community. But would you say that to maximise the benefit to biodiversity, is the best thing to just leave them alone, or lobby for the stopping of use of weed killers or cutting? Or is there a biodiversity value to using these spaces to create pocket parks or to plant trees?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, because what it does is it highlights that we can value one piece of land in lots of different ways. And so the question becomes, if you are thinking in terms of objectives, what do I want this piece of land to achieve? Then yeah, biodiversity is one measure. Wildlife is one measure, community is one measure. Like often these measures can actually be in conflict with each other. So I understand where people are coming from when they say they want to go out and they want to plant it up with pretty flowers. Maybe it'll be community garden. Actually, that's not a bad thing. It is probably in conflict with wildlife values, because it's becoming a controlled space. The species that we're planting there are probably not the ones that would grow there anyway. They depend on human intervention. So those two things are probably in conflict, and I think we just have to accept that, and that neither, both of those things are positive, and so it's a matter of your own personal values when it comes to this project. In terms of how to maximize their benefit to biodiversity, yeah, again, that depends, because biodiversity is actually a very blunt tool. It's simply like the number of species in a space. So this is one argument. If we talk about the fear that we have about invasive species, for example, which is something that I write about, I don't want to get into it here because it's a very complicated subject, but there is one argument that says, well, the spreading of species around the world, it increases biodiversity, in as much as if you look at any particular kilometer, there's probably more species in it now than there was before. That might be at the expense of drowning out different species that only exist in small numbers of places. So biodiversity in itself is actually quite a sort of blunt way of understanding it. Is only one value, as community value, wildlife value. So that is one sort of small warning on that as well. But yes, I do think that if you're worrying about wildlife and biodiversity, then yes, stopping the use of weed killers is a huge thing. That's a very sort of easy thing to stop. And also projects like getting local councils not to mow. My local council actually in the Orkney Isles is amazing at this. They have it probably saves them money actually, but large areas where there's like a football pitch, they might it might be in a huge field, and they will mow only the football pitch but leave everything around it sort of wild for most of the year, and maybe there's one or two paths cut through it, and that means that essentially we've got large numbers of meadows, and meadows are now these days quite a rare sort of environment in the UK, and so it's quite unusual to see sort of like huge areas of unmown grass in that sense. So yeah, I think it really depends on the case, but if leaving things unmowed, that tends to be a good thing, and yeah, don't poison stuff.
No, definitely. So there's a really great question from Alex, which starts to kind of like take into account some of the like scale issues that could be at play here. So I'm going to just slightly reorganize the order of the question just to help ask it. But don't worry too much when that's being posted on the screen. So he says, or she says, I'm not sure, that if humans vanish tomorrow, the damage we've done would, if anything, get worse rather than better. So as nuclear power plants collapse or abandoned oil refineries catch fire and so on. And so the question is, I love the promise of these examples for recovery on a local scale. I wonder what it says for ecosystem restoration more globally. Do you have any opinions on the messages of your work for international efforts to protect the planet?
Let me just make sure that I understand this question. More globally,
I guess the way I see it is about kind of abandonment on a wider scale than
yeah, because I don't think I would be like recommending that we abandon nuclear power plants. I would want to like make that clear. I think what this touches on is that I think the main thing that I took away from my studies was that there are different ways in which we can harm the natural world, and that understanding which of those are sort of the deepest and the darkest ways of damaging the world is an important way of prioritizing not only stopping this damage at the beginning, but also which ones we choose to respond to in the present. So if, for example, cutting down an area of trees is not a nice thing to do, but those trees will likely grow back without our intervention if nothing else happens. But if we are talking about polluting an area with say persistent organic pollutants or with long half-life radiation, then that is, it's like looking at a flesh wound versus a killing wound, and understanding these sort of levels of damage, and therefore preventing especially the worst ones from taking place at all, is very important in sort of learning to prioritize our response to this. This feels like a bit of an oversimplified answer, so I'm not sure I'm being very helpful. Sorry, Alex, but I think I'm keen to say that, like abandoning attempts to stop damage. So, for example, abandoning attempts to stop a nuclear meltdown or something like this is not what I would consider to be conservation. No.
Okay, thanks for that. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to ask a question which sort of speaks to a question that Jeremy Millard from Third Millennium Governance posted in advance of this session, but it's a kind of shorter version of it. It comes from Maria, who says, having visited a wide range of abandoned landscapes and seen how nature reasserts itself, do you personally feel hopeful or despondent about the future of the planet and our place on it? So just quite briefly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really difficult question to answer because it depends so much on the day. I don't know if you feel the same, but certainly some days I wake up and I think that maybe everything would be okay. And the next day, you read one headline and it feels like dark and hopeless. And so I do think that my book, my work exists somewhere between the two. It's very much taken up with the contrasting of dark and light. I don't know that people often describe it as an optimistic book, and I think it is. I think that ultimately that sort of sense of recovery and the scale that I find it on was so surprising that it did catch me off guard and give me a lot of hope and faith that I didn't have before. That's not to say that I don't wake up and have nihilistic thoughts like everybody else who cares about the environment. And I think that to some extent, I position myself and my work on the hopeful end of the scale because I know that I am more motivated by hope than I am by fear. That's not the same for everyone. There is a wonderful book by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth. So if you find yourself to be motivated by fear, his book is the one that you should read, because it's like I stayed up all night reading it, and then I had a sort of like 3-day hangover, but it is like it's an incredible book that will scare the hell out of you about climate change. If, like me, you want to see a sort of like, I don't know, it's like the light in the dark, the light in the crack, the green in the crack of the pavement, that kind of thing. That's my kind of book. I think partly purposefully because I feel like for me, I need to have a sense that my actions can make a difference. And so hope is part of that.
Thanks for that. That's a fantastic answer. And I suppose it's possible to be, and for many of us, we are hopeful and despondent at the same time. I think that's kind of like the two things are tied together. Anyway, we've reached the end of our time, so I'd like to say a huge thank you to Cal for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk through these ideas with you, and I really strongly recommend the book Islands of Abandonment for anybody who hasn't read it. Thanks also to the audience for the questions. Apologies to those whose questions we didn't manage to answer, but thanks very much indeed for participating and posing your questions. I could invite the audience to fill in a short survey, which is going to be shared in the chat and also available in the event description. And as a thank you for filling out that survey, you can enter a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop voucher. The next Nesta Talk To will come from the Fairer Start mission, and that will be on Thursday, the 8th of December. And Jenny Gibson will be talking to Aisha Small, who's Head of Change for Education and Families at the Youth Endowment Fund. and they'll be talking about evidence-based interventions to improve outcomes for young people. That's all that we have time for now. So thanks again to Cal and to everybody for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon.